The Duke watched her laugh with another man, then sent every rose in London to her door. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. Lady Isabella Montgomery was no stranger to London's high society. A woman of grace and beauty, she had always captured the attention of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the city. But there was one man who had never quite been able to let her go. Duke Alexander Hawke, a man known for his cold demeanor and commanding presence, had loved Isabella once. He had been captivated by her light, her warmth, and the laughter that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But all of that had changed one fateful night. A year ago, Isabella had laughed with another man. It wasn't anything more than a casual exchange at a gathering, but for Alexander, it was enough to ignite a fire of jealousy and possessiveness that he had never felt before. His mind couldn't escape the image of her smiling, her eyes sparkling as she spoke to Lord Thomas Blackwell, a man with a reputation for being charming, suave, and just the right amount of dangerous. That moment had broken something inside of Alexander. He couldn't bear the thought of another man winning her affection. So he did what only he could. He sent every rose in London to her door. Hundreds of flowers, each one more extravagant than the last, arrived at her doorstep the following day. Each bouquet was accompanied by a card, each one signed with a single message, asterisk, you belong to me. Asterisk. Isabella stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the lavish display. She was no stranger to admiration, but this was different. This was a declaration from the Duke. Her heart raced as she wondered how to respond. Was this his way of apologizing? Or was it a demand she couldn't refuse? Alexander had always been a man of mystery, and now, it seemed, he was a man of obsession. Little did she know, the roses were just the beginning of a game he had started, one that would change both of their lives forever. And as the days passed, she would realize just how far he was willing to go to make her his again. Days passed, and still the roses arrived. It was as though the entire city of London had been enlisted in Alexander Hawke's obsession. Hundreds of bouquets, each more elaborate than the last, piled up outside Lady Isabella Montgomery's door. She could no longer ignore the sheer intensity of his actions, nor the power he wielded. But as much as she tried to resist, part of her couldn't help but be moved by the gesture. Yet, in her heart, she knew the roses were not a plea for forgiveness. They were a command, a message from a man who once held her heart, and who now wanted to reclaim it, no matter the cost. The fact that she had allowed herself to laugh with another man, to look at Lord Thomas Blackwell with anything more than casual indifference, had shattered Alexander's world. And now, he was determined to make sure she never forgot that. Isabella tried to brush it off, to convince herself that it was just a simple gift. But deep inside, she knew it was more than that. She had always known Alexander to be a man of control, a man who didn't let anything slip through his fingers. And she knew that he was not the type to accept being replaced. A week after the first delivery of roses, Isabella found herself standing at the window of her drawing room, staring out at the busy streets of London. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the chill of an early winter. Her fingers rested on the curtain, as if trying to find some connection to the world outside, but her thoughts were consumed by the Duke. She could still remember the way he had looked at her that night, his eyes cold and filled with unspoken words. His silence had been deafening, and his presence had haunted her ever since. What was he thinking? Was he truly that jealous? Did he still care for her, or was this just his way of reminding her of his power? She didn't know, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to find out. But as the days wore on, Isabella's thoughts turned to Lord Thomas. He had been a comfort to her in the weeks following her emotional breakup with Alexander. Thomas had always been kind, always there when she needed someone to talk to. They had shared laughs, confidences, and even some quiet moments of solace. But as much as she had enjoyed his company, she knew she couldn't allow herself to feel anything more for him. Not now, and certainly not when Alexander was watching. She had to keep her distance. Her mind was racing, her emotions in turmoil. That evening, she received a letter, its wax seal unmistakable. It was from Alexander. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling as she read the words. Meet me tonight at the opera. I will be waiting. Do not disappoint me, Isabella. The note was short, but the weight of it pressed down on her like a physical force. What could he want from her now? Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of excitement and fear. She had no choice but to go. She had never been able to resist him, and now she was about to walk right into his trap. The evening arrived, and Isabella found herself standing at the entrance of the Grand Opera House, her breath visible in the cold air. She had never been so unsure of herself. The familiar faces of London's elite passed her by, but she paid them no mind. Her focus was solely on the man who had asked her to meet him. As she walked through the ornate doors, her heart skipped a beat when she saw him. Alexander stood at the far end of the grand hall, his tall frame a pillar of strength and confidence. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to disappear. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. He said nothing as she approached, but his presence was overwhelming. The words she had rehearsed in her mind all day escaped her. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. Alexander reached out, his hand brushing hers in a silent command to follow him. She did, like a puppet on a string, unable to break free. They made their way to a private box, far removed from the crowds below. The opera began, but neither of them paid attention to the performance. They were locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice low and filled with an edge that sent a chill down her spine. You have no idea what you've done to me, Isabella, he said, his words sharp. But I'll make sure you never forget. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as he moved closer, his body heat radiating toward her. She could feel the intensity of his gaze as he leaned in, his lips almost touching her ear. I warned you, he whispered, his voice hoarse. No one else can have you. Isabella froze, her pulse racing. She had known this moment would come, but she had never expected it to feel this real, this overwhelming. She had been foolish to think she could ever escape him. As Alexander's presence consumed her, she realized there was no going back. She was his, body and soul. Isabella could feel the tension between them crackle in the air, a living thing that filled the space around them, suffocating, inescapable. She had tried to keep her distance, to forget the Duke's possessive nature, but it seemed that every step she took away from him only pulled her closer. She had no choice but to go along with him, to let him lead her deeper into his world, a world she no longer recognized but was undeniably drawn to. The opera had continued around them, but Isabella was aware of nothing except for the man beside her, his presence as commanding as the storm outside, a storm that mirrored the chaos inside her. Duke Alexander Hawke had always been a man of control, of calculated movements and precise actions, but tonight, his silence spoke volumes. As the curtains fell on the opera, the final act of the night, Alexander turned to her, his eyes cold, unreadable, like the surface of a still lake that hid the deep currents beneath. You've made your decision, Isabella, he said, his voice steady, but there was an undeniable edge to it. Isabella's throat tightened. She had made no such decision. She had been trying, desperately, to resist his pull, to carve out a space for herself where she could breathe, but every gesture, every glance, every move he made pulled her further into his orbit. What do you want from me? She finally managed to ask, her voice small, her heart racing. You know exactly what I want, Alexander replied, his voice low, almost a growl. He took a step closer, and Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat. The intensity of his gaze, the weight of his presence, left her feeling helpless, as if she had no control over her own body, over her own emotions. You've belonged to me from the moment you stepped into my world, he continued, his voice soft but firm. And I will not allow anyone to take you from me, not even yourself. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine, and though part of her wanted to fight back, to scream, to push him away, another part of her, a part she couldn't ignore, was terrified of what might happen if she did. She had been warned by everyone around her, her friends, her family, that Alexander was not a man to be trifled with, that his obsession could consume her. But now, standing in front of him, she realized that she was already too far gone. You think you can control me? She asked, her voice shaky, but she held his gaze, refusing to show the fear she felt inside. Alexander's lips curled into a small, almost amused smile. Control? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't need to control you, Isabella. I already have you. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers grazing her skin like a spark that ignited the fire inside her. You can fight it all you want, but you'll always come back to me, he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. Isabella closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing heart, trying to pull away from the heat that was spreading through her, but it was no use. She could feel her resolve crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of his words, under the intensity of his touch. As if sensing her weakness, Alexander moved even closer, pressing his body against hers. The world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them in that dark, intimate space. You don't have a choice anymore, he said, his voice a soft, deadly promise. Isabella wanted to scream, to push him away, but she didn't. She couldn't. She had never been able to resist him, and now, standing face with the man who had once held her heart, she realized just how powerless she was. The storm outside raged on, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside her, a storm that she could neither control nor escape. Alexander's hand slipped around her waist, pulling her closer, and she felt the heat of his body against hers, the undeniable magnetism that had always drawn her in. And in that moment, she knew there was no turning back. She was his, and he was not about to let her go. The days following that fateful night seemed to blur together for Isabella. Each moment spent in Alexander's presence weighed heavily on her, yet she found herself drawn to him in ways she could neither explain nor control. She had tried to distance herself, to remind herself of the world she once knew, but with every passing day, Alexander's influence over her grew stronger. He was everywhere. His gaze, his words, his actions haunted her thoughts, and she could feel him in every corner of her life, suffocating her, yet offering her an odd sense of security. She could not escape him. He was no longer just a part of her past. He was her present, her future, whether she wanted it or not. Isabella had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to stand on her own, but with Alexander, everything she knew had changed. She felt like a moth to the flame, unable to pull away even as she knew the heat would burn her. She found herself thinking about him at the most unexpected times, his words echoing in her mind, his touch lingering on her skin like a ghost that would not leave. One evening, as she sat alone in her drawing room, a letter arrived. It was from Alexander. His handwriting was elegant, as always, and the words seemed to leap off the page. Meet me at the estate tonight. I expect you to come alone. Don't keep me waiting, Isabella. The command was clear, and though part of her wanted to refuse, to stand her ground, she knew she would go. She had no power to resist him. That night, Isabella arrived at the estate, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with tension, and as she stepped inside, she felt the familiar presence of Alexander looming over her. He was standing by the grand staircase, his back turned, but she could feel his attention on her, as if every step she took was being measured. You came, he said, his voice low, almost satisfied, as he turned to face her. There was no smile, no warmth in his expression, only the cold intensity that had come to define him. But there was something else in his eyes, something darker, more possessive than she had ever seen before. Of course, I came, Isabella replied, her voice steady, though her hands betrayed her, trembling ever so slightly. You didn't give me much of a choice. Alexander's lips curled into a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. I don't give you choices, Isabella. You should know that by now. He reached out and gently cupped her chin, forcing her to look up at him. You belong to me. Don't ever forget that. The words were a declaration, a claim, and they sent a shiver down her spine. She opened her mouth to protest, to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? He was right, in a way. She had already given herself to him in ways she couldn't undo. Isabella wanted to run, wanted to escape from this suffocating connection, but she was rooted to the spot. Her body was betraying her as much as her heart. You will never leave me, Isabella, Alexander continued, his voice softer now, but no less forceful. You are mine, now and forever. He kissed her, and it was as if the world stopped. Time stretched out, and all she could feel was him. His lips on hers, his hands on her body, pulling her closer as if he never wanted to let her go. Isabella knew she should pull away, that this was wrong, but she couldn't. She didn't want to. She had been fighting this for so long, trying to keep her distance, but now, in this moment, she realized just how much she had already surrendered. Alexander's kiss was not gentle, not tender. It was filled with the intensity of his obsession, his need, his control. She could feel it in every movement, every touch. He was claiming her in the way only he could, and she was powerless to stop him. When he finally pulled away, his eyes locked onto hers, searching, waiting for some kind of response. Isabella swallowed hard, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You still think you can control me," she said, her voice shaky but defiant. Alexander smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent another wave of fear through her. "I don't need to control you, Isabella," he said softly. "I already do." Isabella awoke the next morning with a start, her breath shallow, her heart still racing from the events of the previous night. The kiss, the claim, the undeniable force of Alexander's presence still lingered on her lips, in her skin, in her very bones. It was as if she couldn't escape him, no matter how hard she tried. The realization settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had already surrendered to him, even when she hadn't intended to. The constant barrage of roses, the cold, possessive glances, the forceful way he had taken control. Alexander Hawke was not a man who could be ignored or defied. He had made it clear that she belonged to him, and part of her wondered if it was too late to change anything. Would she ever be free again, or had she already been marked by him? She stood from her bed, her thoughts swirling like the storm outside, and walked to the window. London lay beneath a gray sky, the morning mist hanging low over the city. It was a bleak day, the kind that mirrored her mood. Everything felt uncertain, heavy, like the calm before a storm. As she stood there, lost in thought, a knock at the door interrupted her reverie. She tensed, the all-too-familiar tension creeping into her chest. "Come in," she called, her voice betraying her unease. The door opened, and her maid, Charlotte, entered with a letter in her hand. Isabella's heart sank when she saw the seal. It was from Alexander. She hesitated for a moment before taking the letter from Charlotte's outstretched hand. As she broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, her fingers trembled. The words were short, direct, and, as always, commanding. "I expect you at my estate tonight. Do not disappoint me. Come alone." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. How was she supposed to respond to this? She had no choice, not really. She could feel the pressure of his will pushing down on her, suffocating her, making it impossible to refuse. As much as she hated to admit it, she couldn't escape him. She was already in too deep. The day dragged on, each moment a struggle against the pull of Alexander's demand. She tried to focus on other things, tried to find some semblance of peace in the chaos of her mind, but it was no use. As the evening approached, she found herself preparing to leave, to go to him. She couldn't avoid it any longer. The pull of his obsession, his need, was too strong. It wasn't love, not the kind she had once dreamed of, but it was something else, something dark and dangerous. She had no idea what awaited her at his estate, but she knew one thing for sure. Alexander was waiting for her, and she would never be free of him. When she arrived at the estate, the night had already fallen, the mansion looming dark and silent before her. It felt like entering a different world, a world where she was no longer in control, a world where Alexander's presence reigned supreme. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest, and immediately she felt the weight of his gaze on her. He was standing in the shadows, watching her, waiting for her to make the first move. "You came," he said, his voice low, almost predatory. Isabella didn't respond, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. The tension between them was palpable, thick and suffocating, like a storm waiting to break. "Of course I came," she replied, her voice steady, though inside she was trembling. "You don't leave me much choice." Alexander smiled, but it was not a smile that reached his eyes. It was cold, calculated, as if he were pleased with her submission. "No, you don't," he said softly. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Isabella felt the familiar heat rising between them, the same heat that had burned her before. She tried to resist, tried to fight against the magnetic pull that he had over her, but it was no use. She was powerless. "You belong to me, Isabella," Alexander murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. "And I will not let anyone take you from me." His words were like a brand, searing her soul, and though part of her wanted to run, part of her wanted to push him away, another part of her welcomed the feeling, welcomed the intimacy, the desire. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't deny the truth. She was his. She had always been his. And no matter how much she fought it, she knew that in the end, he would have her. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice low, his hand sliding around her waist, pulling her closer. "You will never leave me. You can try, but I will always find you. Always." Isabella's breath hitched as his words settled deep within her, a promise and a warning all in one. She closed her eyes, unable to fight the overwhelming emotions that swirled inside her. She was trapped, bound to him in a way that she couldn't escape, no matter how much she wished for freedom. Alexander's hold on her was complete, and she had no choice but to accept it. As the night stretched on, Isabella knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. She was his, and he would never let her go. The days that followed felt like a blur to Isabella. Each moment spent with Alexander felt like a step deeper into a world she no longer recognized. She had become a prisoner, not of walls or bars, but of his unrelenting presence, his demanding gaze, and the hold he had on her heart. She tried to escape it, tried to rationalize her feelings, but no matter how hard she tried to deny it, she knew she was trapped. She had been drawn to him from the very start, pulled into his world by a force stronger than any willpower she could muster. Now, in the confines of his estate, she had no choice but to accept the reality of their relationship, or what had become of it. The power struggle between them was undeniable. He had marked her as his, and every action he took reinforced that claim. The roses, the late-night visits, the possessive words, they were all part of a larger game that Isabella hadn't realized she had already lost. And yet, when he looked at her with those dark, intense eyes, when his hand grazed her skin in a way that was both tender and demanding, she couldn't help but feel something stir deep inside her. It was a dangerous feeling, one that threatened to consume her, and she hated herself for it. She hated how he had the ability to make her feel both powerless and powerful all at once. She hated how her heart raced every time he stepped into the room, how her body responded to his touch even when her mind screamed at her to resist. It was a cruel paradox, one that made her question everything she had ever believed about herself. One evening, as Isabella sat by the fire in the drawing room, lost in thought, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She knew it was him before he even entered the room. The air shifted, the tension thickened, and in that moment, she realized just how much she had already given up. Alexander stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the dim light, his presence filling the room with an undeniable intensity. He didn't speak at first, just watched her with that cold, calculating gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. Isabella didn't move, didn't look away. She had learned long ago that resistance was futile, that when he wanted something, he would take it, whether it was her body or her heart. And now, as he approached her, she knew he wanted both. "Isabella," he finally said, his voice low and rich, like velvet wrapping around her. "You've been distant lately." His words were not an accusation, but a statement, one that made her heart skip a beat. She didn't answer right away, unsure of what to say. How could she explain the turmoil inside her, the conflict that tore at her every time she looked at him? "I haven't been distant," she replied finally, though her voice betrayed her. "I've been thinking." Alexander's lips curled into a half-smile, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You think too much," he said, his voice rough with something darker, something more possessive. "It's a habit you'll need to break if you're ever going to truly be mine." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to argue, to say something that would push him away, but she couldn't. Not now. Not when he was standing so close to her, when the heat of his body was almost unbearable. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek in a movement so gentle it almost felt like a caress. "You belong to me, Isabella," he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet the weight of his words hit her, like a wave crashing over her. "And I won't let anyone take you from me." His fingers traced the line of her jaw, sending a shiver through her, and for a moment, Isabella felt herself lose control. She could feel the desire building within her, the longing that had always been there, buried beneath the surface. She hated it, hated how easily he could make her feel this way. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, trying to push the feelings away. "I don't belong to you," she said, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "You do," he countered, his tone unwavering, his hand now gently cupping her face. "You always have, and you always will." The world seemed to close in around them, the air thick with the weight of his words, the tension between them rising to a fever pitch. Isabella opened her eyes, and for the first time, she saw something in Alexander's gaze that made her heart falter. It was not the cold, possessive gaze he usually wore, but something softer, something deeper, something that made her question whether he truly cared for her, or if this was all just part of his game. But before she could process her thoughts, Alexander leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both gentle and demanding. Isabella's body responded instantly, her hands reaching for him, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, she forgot everything. The anger, the confusion, the fear. All that mattered was him, and the feeling of his lips on hers, the taste of him, the way he made her feel like she was the only thing in the world. When they finally pulled away, Isabella was breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Alexander whispered, his voice husky. "To be mine. To give yourself to me." Isabella looked up at him, her mind racing, her emotions in turmoil. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what to feel. All she knew was that she was falling deeper into his world, and there was no way out. Isabella could hardly believe what was happening. She had thought, for a moment, that the kiss they shared had changed something, that it had awakened some kind of connection between them that she couldn't deny. But as Alexander pulled back, his gaze still, dark and intense, she realized she couldn't escape him, not now, not ever. She had given herself to him in ways that went far beyond physical desire. She had surrendered her soul, and in return, he had claimed her, body and mind. She was his, and the realization sent a shiver through her. She could feel the weight of his words echoing in her mind, each one a reminder of her helplessness. "You belong to me, Isabella." She wanted to protest, to fight back, but she didn't know how anymore. She didn't know where to go, who to turn to. All she had was him, and the life he had carved out for them both. "You're quiet," Alexander said, his voice laced with both amusement and a hint of something darker. "I've never known you to be quiet." Isabella looked up at him, her eyes searching his for any sign of tenderness, any sign that this might be more than his obsession. But there was nothing. His eyes were cold, calculating, like they always were. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. What could she say? The truth was, she was no longer sure of anything. She had been pulled into a whirlwind, and she didn't know how to stop it. He stepped closer, his hand resting on her waist, as if marking his territory. "You'll stop fighting me soon enough, Isabella," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "You'll see. In the end, you'll realize this is where you belong." She flinched at his words, not because they shocked her, but because part of her knew that, in some way, he was right. She had been resisting him, fighting her feelings, but with every passing day, she found herself being pulled deeper into his world. She was his, and somehow, she knew she always would be. He had a way of making her feel small, insignificant, yet entirely essential to his existence. "I want to know everything about you," Alexander continued, his voice low, almost a growl. "I want to know what makes you tick, what keeps you awake at night. You're not going anywhere, Isabella. Not now, not ever." Isabella couldn't breathe. She wanted to fight him, to scream at him to stop, but she couldn't. She had no strength left. His presence had drained her, consumed her, and somehow, she had let it happen. "What is it that you want from me?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down her spine. "I don't want anything from you, Isabella," he said softly, as if the answer should have been obvious. "I already have everything. You're mine, and that's all I need." Isabella closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had heard them before, countless times, but each time, they sounded more real, more terrifying. She was his, and nothing would ever change that. As he pulled her closer, his lips brushing against her neck, Isabella couldn't help but wonder if she would ever be free again. Would she always be bound to him? Was there any hope for escape? She couldn't imagine life without him, not now. Even though part of her longed for freedom, for the chance to break away and reclaim her life, she knew, deep down, that she had already given him everything. She had already chosen him. She had already lost. "You'll never be free of me," Alexander whispered, as if reading her thoughts. "And that's exactly how you want it, Isabella. Deep down you know it." She opened her eyes and met his gaze, and in that moment, she realized he was right. She was his, and there was no going back. She was trapped, but in a strange way, she didn't want to leave. She was bound to him, and in some twisted way, she needed him. The pull he had on her was too strong to resist. She didn't know how to break free, and a part of her didn't want to. She was his, and he was never letting her go. Days passed, and Isabella found herself unable to break free from the grip Alexander had on her. The more she tried to distance herself, the more tangled in his web she became. She could feel his presence in every corner of her life, his influence seeping into her thoughts, her every action, and, worst of all, her heart. No matter how much she told herself she could escape, that she could leave him behind, she knew the truth. She was already lost. She had already given herself to him, and it seemed there was no turning back. The roses still arrived every day, each one more extravagant than the last, a constant reminder of Alexander's hold on her, a visual declaration that she was his, body and soul. She tried to ignore them, to push the feelings aside, but it was impossible. The scent of the flowers filled the house, and with each passing day, it became harder and harder to pretend she wasn't falling deeper under his control. Alexander knew how to get what he wanted, and right now, he wanted her. Not just in body, but in mind and spirit. He had claimed her completely, and no matter how much she wanted to fight it, she couldn't deny that part of her wanted him just as badly. Isabella hated herself for the way her body responded to him, for the way her heart raced when he was near, and for the way she felt every time he looked at her with that dark, possessive gaze. She had never felt so trapped, yet at the same time, so desired. Every night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake, wondering if there was a way out. But every morning, when she saw him again, when his gaze locked with hers, she knew the truth. There was no way out. He was the storm, and she was caught in it. One evening, after dinner, Alexander led her to the drawing room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. Isabella felt the weight of his gaze as he sat beside her on the sofa, his presence overwhelming. "You're mine, Isabella," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "And I will never let you go." She opened her mouth to protest, to say something, anything, but the words died on her lips. How could she argue with the truth? She had already given him everything, and he had taken it without hesitation. "You think you're still in control," he continued, his hand reaching for hers. "But I am. You will never be free of me. You belong to me, and I will make sure you understand that." Isabella flinched at his words, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. It was as if he had a power over her, something she couldn't explain, but that was undeniable. His touch sent sparks through her skin, and the closer he got, the more she felt. Like she was drowning in him. "I hate you," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. It wasn't hate she felt. It was something much more dangerous, something that scared her more than anything else. Alexander chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. "You don't hate me, Isabella," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "You're just scared of what you feel. You're scared because you know you can't fight it. You're scared because you know you want me just as much as I want you." Isabella shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. She did want him. She hated how much she wanted him, but it was the truth. And no matter how much she tried to push it away, no matter how much she told herself that she couldn't be with him, that she couldn't let him control her, she knew it was already too late. He had already won. She was already his. "I don't want to be your possession," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to be someone you control." "You are," he replied softly, his hand cupping her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You always will be." His lips brushed against her forehead, a simple, tender gesture, but one that sent her heart racing all the same. "You belong to me." he whispered again, his voice filled with quiet intensity. Isabella closed her eyes, unable to fight the way her body responded to him. She was his, and deep down, she knew she always would be. There was no escaping him. There was no escaping the pull he had on her. Alexander Hawke had claimed her, body and soul, and nothing would ever change that. The days bled into one another, each as heavy and suffocating as the last. Isabella felt herself trapped in a world of luxury and darkness, caught between the walls of Alexander's grand estate and the constant pull he had on her. She had tried to resist him, tried to push back against the overwhelming force of his obsession, but each time she failed. She was lost in a world where Alexander Hawke was the center, where his words, his actions, his gaze defined everything. She had become his possession, and though part of her wanted to escape, she knew deep down that she never would. She was his, in every sense of the word, and there was no getting out of it. As time went on, Isabella found herself retreating further into herself, becoming more and more isolated from the world around her. She had no friends, no allies. Alexander made sure of that. He controlled every aspect of her life, from the clothes she wore to the places she went, to the people she spoke to. He had cut her off from everything and everyone she had once known. And yet, despite the suffocating control he had over her, despite the fact that she was his captive, she still couldn't bring herself to hate him. Part of her still wanted him, still needed him, and that terrified her more than anything else. One evening, as the sky outside darkened and the wind howled against the windows, Isabella sat in her favorite chair by the fire, lost in her thoughts. She could hear Alexander's footsteps approaching, his presence filling the room before he even entered. He walked in, as tall and imposing as ever, his gaze fixed firmly on her. "Isabella," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "You've been quiet lately." She looked up at him, her heart racing. "I've been thinking," she replied softly. "About what?" he asked, his voice still cold but laced with something that almost resembled curiosity. Isabella hesitated, unsure of how to express the confusion that had been swirling in her mind for days. "About how I got here," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "How I ended up trapped in this life with you." Alexander's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark crossing his face. He took a step toward her, his presence swallowing the space between them. "You're not trapped," he said, his voice low and almost soothing. "You're exactly where you belong." Isabella swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She knew the truth of his words, knew that she could never leave, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. "I don't belong here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Alexander's expression softened slightly, but his gaze remained intense. "You do," he said, his voice firm. "You always have, and you always will." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek in a gesture that was almost tender, yet it felt more like ownership than affection. Isabella closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. "You can't make me feel something I don't want to feel," she said, her voice shaking. Alexander chuckled softly, his hand moving down to cup her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You already feel it," he said quietly, "and you know it." Isabella wanted to argue, wanted to fight back, but the truth was she couldn't. She couldn't deny the way her heart raced when he touched her, the way her body responded to him even when she tried to resist. She was trapped, bound to him in a way she couldn't escape. And deep down, part of her didn't want to. Alexander leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both gentle and demanding. Isabella melted into it, unable to fight the pull that he had on her. She hated herself for it, hated how easily he could make her forget everything, but it was no use. She was his, and she knew it. When the kiss ended, Alexander pulled away slightly, his eyes dark with something that could only be described as satisfaction. "You're mine," he whispered, his voice husky, "and I'll never let you go." Isabella closed her eyes, unable to speak. She couldn't say anything because, deep down, she knew he was right. She was his, and there was no escaping it. Alexander Hawke had claimed her, body and soul, and she would never be free again.